فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So last time we talked about Zakariyya, and we talked about how Zakariyya starts this surah or this chapter. This is the surah or the chapter on Mary, Maryam, and we see that the Qur'an begins talking about another figure, and that figure is Zakariyya. And it begins by talking about the mercy that God gives or provides to Zakariyya, and then it continues and talks about what that mercy is. So for today, we're going to examine the call that Zakariyya makes to God in a state of secrecy and in a state of humility. So verse number 3 reads, "When he called to his Lord secretly, saying, Lord, my bones have become weak, and my hair is ashen gray, but never, Lord, have I ever prayed to you in vain." So we began this section of the surah by talking about how Zakariyya is in a state of submission. He's in a state of vulnerability, of weakness. He's now older. He is not the young man that he used to be. And the Arabic is very clear that he's making a prayer. So it begins by saying, إِذْ نَادَى رَبَّهُ نِدَاءً خَفِيًّا. So here the word nada is used. And literally the word nada means to call. And what is he calling? He is calling his Lord. So the word nada is used in the Qur'an to talk about the adhan or the call to prayer. It's also used to talk about how the people of heaven and hell are calling to one another. But here, the word is used as a call to God. But it's a very interesting private call. Nida'an khafiyya. So here is the maf'ul mutlaq, or the cognitive accusative in Arabic, and it describes the verb. It has an adverbial type of usage. And here, where the Arabic describes what type of call this is. So this is a private call, or this is a call that's done secretly. And what's important here is that when someone calls, usually it's done out loud and everyone can hear. So think about a call to prayer. Think about people coming to the synagogue or church or mosque, and someone is calling them, or you hear bells or a horn, right? You hear this noise that's audible. But this is fascinating, almost an oxymoron. A call that's done in a state of private. And the commentators discuss this. They say, what is going on here, right? Is this a call made out loud that everyone can hear, or is it just something that Zakariyya even said in his mind? And they come to the conclusion, as Qurtubi said, that this was something that he said out loud, but only he could hear. Maybe something he said in prayer, something that he said to himself. And he did it because he didn't want anyone to know. And we'll see that this theme is important because Maryam, later in the chapter, she will also make a call to God and express her vulnerability and pain, but it will be done in private. Other people will not hear except for the reader, which makes you feel more close and intimate to them. So Zakariyya makes this call in private, maybe because he's embarrassed, maybe because he doesn't want anyone else to know, that he doesn't want people to realize his vulnerability, that he doesn't have any children, that he is an old man, and that there's no one going to follow him in this earth. And part of the Quranic narrative is to create this intimacy with the reader. So here, the reader is getting the inner thoughts and desires and hopes and dreams of Zakariyya. That through this narrative, we see something that Zakariyya wants, but he may be not disclosing to the rest of the community. And then the Arabic continues and says, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي وَهَنَ الْعَظَمِ. So literally my bones have become brittle and weak. And once again, the commentators talk about this. Why does he talk about his bones, right? He could have talked about his eyes or his skin. But he mentions his bones because that's the core of the body. That makes the body stand up and be strong. So the core of his being, his physical being, is becoming weak. وَاشْتَعَلَ الرَّأْسُ شَيْبًا, and my entire head has become white. So as we know, as we get older, all of a sudden we see these white hairs start appearing in different places, and it's a gradual aging process. So most people have some white hair or some regular brown or black or blonde hair. But here he's saying, I've completely become white and I'm older and I'm no longer that young person that I was. So he talks about his insides, his inner, his bones are becoming weak. He's not as strong. He's not as physical or athletic. And he's also talking about his outward appearance, which now has demonstrated and shows to everyone that he's older. وَلَمْ أَكُمْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّ شَقِيًّا, and every time I go to you, you have answered my prayer. And he says to God, have I ever prayed to you in vain? Or in another translation, but I've never been disappointed in my prayer to you. So he's talking about a relationship. He's talking about his relationship to God, that God is powerful, God is strong. Qawi al-Aziz, he's powerful and almighty, but he is weak. So he begins this prayer first in a state of secrecy and privacy. Then he talks about his own weakness, his age. He can't get back those years. And he's saying to God, you're the most powerful. You have the ability. And we have this relationship that goes back, that whenever I call out to you, you respond to me. So now I'm actually making another prayer. Now, when I looked at this verse and compared it to others, and especially I was really fascinated with this word nada, or to call, because to call in Arabic is something, as we discussed, that's audible. Other people can hear it. And think about, once again, the call to prayer. And when I searched and researched the Qur'an on this word, you see that it's connected to other calls of anguish. So Zakariyya, as we see here in Surat Maryam, he makes a call out talking about his age and how he doesn't have any children. But there are other calls in the chapter itself, like we see with Maryam, as she will later say that I wish I'd been forgotten and died before all of this, but also in other late Meccan surahs. So one of the advantages, or one of the things we're focusing on in this podcast, is this late Meccan era. So oftentimes people think of Islam, they think of Islamic Sharia, they think of war, they think of violence, they think of rules and regulations. But in this late Meccan era was a time of weakness and vulnerability. And it was a time where the Muslim community was looking for options. What should we do? Should we migrate? Should we stay here? And they were tortured and persecuted. So in this moment, in this late Meccan era, we see a lot of calls of vulnerability. We see a lot of calls to God asking for help. And one of the other calls that we see here in the Qur'an is in Surah Anbiya. So there is a whole section in the chapter of the prophets that talks about these calls, whether that be of Job, of Ayub, Nuh, Noah, and then Yunus or Jonah. And I want to connect this call of Zakariyya to that of Yunus, because this is arguably one of the most famous calls in the Qur'an, and it has similar structure to that we see of Zakariyya, and then later that Maryam. So the chapter of the prophets, or Surah Anbiya, in verse 87, mentions the story of Yunus, or as it discusses, the Nun. So it mentions that the Nun, or the man of the whale, ذهب مغاضبا. So he left and he was angry, thinking we could not restrict him, but then he cried out in the deep darkness, there is no God but you, glory be to him, I was wrong. We answered him and saved him from his distress. This is how we save the faithful. So this verse starts off where Yunus goes and he's angry. And this is one of the things I enjoy about the Qur'an and reading it, is how it talks about emotions. And there's been a lot of interesting research on the idea of emotions, of huzn, of sadness, of khawf, of fear, of ghadab, of anger. And here, Yunus is angry, right? He's angry, and the commentators talk about how he's angry at his people. He's frustrated that they're not listening to his call. فَظَنَّ أَلَّن نَقْدِرَ عَلَيْهِ. So he thought that no one would restrict him, that no one would restrain him, that he would leave and he would be able to go, right? God would not care or reprimand him and he would be able to go on his way, and he would abdicate his role as a prophet. فَنَادَى فِي الظُّلُمَاتِ. And you see here the same verb is used. So he calls in the darkness. So this verb, once again, of calling is connected to all these other calls. And one of the modern moves in Quranic studies is to see echoes. So you see a verse or a word in one chapter, and then you look throughout the chapter and you see echoes. The same word is used in the same chapter or is connected to other figures. So we see that this is an echo, that this verb is connecting all these other biblical and Quranic figures. So he's calling out fil dhulumat, in the darkness. And this word is often used in the Qur'an to talk about spiritual darkness, that people cry in the darkness, but they find light and nur, or the idea of light with God. So he's calling out in the darkness. So this could be interpreted either as a spiritual darkness or a physical one. And the commentators talk about how he finds darkness in the well, he finds darkness in the sea, and he finds darkness in the night. So this isn't one darkness, but there's multiple darknesses upon darkness. And then he calls and he says, Allah ilaha illa ant, subhanak inni kuntu min al-zalimin. So then he makes this famous call, and it's a call that many Muslims will make, and it's a prayer that Muslims will make in times of despair and desperation. And he says, there is no God except for you. So once again, he's affirming God, the unity, the monotheism of God, that God is unique, that there is nothing similar to him, and that subhanak, that verily glory be to you, that you are distinct from the rest of creation. So he begins by affirming God. Then he transitions to affirming that God is wonderful and gloriful. And he once again moves to affirming the glory of God. And then he begins as Inni kuntu min al-zalimin. He says, verily I am among those who transgress or do what is wrong. So what's interesting here is that Yunus doesn't just start the prayer and says, I did something, I made a mistake. Rather, he starts with this preface, that the idea of affirming God, that God is unique, praising God, and then saying, verily, I am the wrongdoer. So we see this theme within Quranic figures, that when they make a prayer, they don't just go and state what they want, right? Zakariyya could have said, God, give me a child, right? But he begins and he talks about his state. He talks about how he's feeling. He talks about his inners, right? His bones and his outers, his hair. And he talks about how he is in this state of aging and how he has a special relationship with God. And similarly, we see that Yunus, he doesn't just say, God, get me out of the well. He also makes a similar statement. He begins by saying, affirming God, glorifying God, and then speaking about his transgression. Now, the commentators here, they make a fascinating point, and they say Yunus doesn't actually ask to be released from the well. He just says, I am among the wrongdoers. I made a mistake. And they contemplate this and they say, why doesn't he just ask? Why doesn't he say, God, expel me from this well? So they make the point that he didn't necessarily have to do that, right? He understood that God is all-knowing, God is powerful, God is transcendent. And because God is absolute, he knew what Yunus wanted, right? He didn't want to stay in the belly of the whale. But what he felt he needed to do is admit to God his mistake, to repent, and to engage in Toba, or returning to God and spiritual renewal. Then the verse continues and says, فَاسْتَجَبْنَا لَهُ وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْغَمِّ. So the answer is that we responded, we answered his prayer and rescued him from anguish. And what's remarkable here is the idea of this fa. So this fa in Arabic means then. So fastajabna, then we listened, we answered the call. So he made this call, right? Nada. And because he called out in a state of sincerity and humility, then God responds and saves them min al-gham. So that's a fascinating word as well, that it's not that God and the angels saved Yunus from the whale or even from the darkness, but from his sadness, from his anguish, his despair, that he was in this state of distress, and he called out, and then God saved him. So really, even though he is in the story in the ocean and in this strange place and in the whale's mouth, then the real ailment, the real pain was his anguish, his sadness, not necessarily his physical location. وَكَذَلِكَ نُجْزِي الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And this is how we save the true believers. So this verse is mentioning the story of Yunus, but it's really a model for other believers. That if other believers want to be saved, then they should make a similar prayer to that of Yunus. So in conclusion, we've seen the idea of the call. Zakariyya begins this chapter calling to God, but this is an interesting call. It's a private call. It's a call only that God can hear. And it's a call that he makes because he has a special relationship with God and he doesn't want others to hear. And when he makes this call, he doesn't go out and ask directly, God, give me a child. Rather, he begins by talking about his weakness, his vulnerabilities, his humility. And he talks about his inside, his bones, and how his physical appearance has changed. And then he moves to talk about his special relationship with God, that every time I go to you, you respond. And we see this structure is found in other Quranic calls, that with other figures in the Qur'an, when they make calls, as we see with Yunus, they don't just blurt out what they want, but they begin by praising God, talking about their situation, and then also speaking about their wrongdoings, their mistakes. And they have this common theme of being humble to God. And we see that these calls are connected to one another, that they're echoes in the Qur'an. And we'll see later how the call of Zakariyya, Yunus, Noah, as well as Ayub, Job, are all connected to that of Maryam. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to subscribe, encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to the podcast. Feel free to email me and text me any thoughts, ideas you have regarding the content, people I can interview, themes you want me to explore. You're welcome to review this podcast. Give me some feedback and visit my website and join my newsletter where I'll be updating you on the publication of my forthcoming book. Thanks once again for your support and take care.